just for a moment, and let yourself drift back in time. Not to a battlefield, not to a hall filled with shouting voices, but to something far simpler, far gentler, to a morning very long ago, when the land that would become the United States of America was still just land, just fields and forests and slow-moving rivers and air so clean. It tasted like something you could almost name. It is the early 18th century. Perhaps it is morning. The sun is only just beginning to lift itself above the tree line, painting the eastern sky in the softest shades of amber and rose. There are no electric lights here, no distant hum of engines. There is only bird song and the occasional lowing of cattle from somewhere beyond the tree line, and the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke curling upward from chimneys in small, scattered villages. The colonies there are 13 of them, stretched along the eastern edge of this vast, largely unexplored continent, are places of remarkable simplicity. The roads are unpaved, dusty in summer, and thick with mud in the autumn rains. The houses are mostly made of wood, some of brick where the families are more prosperous. The windows are small because glass is precious, and the light that filters through them in the morning lands on rough-hewn floors in soft, golden squares. Life moves at the pace of the seasons. You wake when the light comes. You work when the work is there. You rest when darkness falls. And in the evenings, in the hour or two before sleep, the whole world seems to settle into a kind of quiet that is almost impossible to describe. A hush that holds everything gently, the way a river holds a stone. The people who live in these colonies have come from many places. Many are the children or grandchildren of those who crossed the vast Atlantic Ocean from England, from Scotland, from Germany and the Netherlands. Others have been born right here, in this new and unfamiliar land, and have never known anything else. They are farmers, mostly, craftsmen, merchants who trade goods up and down the coast by sea, or overland on those long, slow, dusty roads. They think of themselves, for the most part, as English. They speak English. They follow English laws. They pay taxes to the English crown. The king sits far away across the ocean, a distant, almost abstract figure. And for the most part, life in the colonies goes on, much as it always has. There is the planting season and the harvest. There is the Sunday gathering at the small wooden church. There is the warmth of neighbors sharing a meal, or the quiet solitude of a long winter evening by the fire. No one, on a soft autumn morning, in the year 1710, or 1720, or even 1740, could quite imagine that these scattered settlements, these small farms and modest towns, would one day become something new, something that had never existed before. A nation built not on the authority of kings or the inheritance of bloodlines, but on the quiet, steady belief that all people carry within them a kind of natural dignity, a right to live as they choose, to speak their minds, to determine the shape of their own lives. But that idea is coming. It is not here yet. It is still growing, slowly, the way a seed grows in dark earth, underground, unseen, taking its time. And the people who will tend that seed, who will help it become something larger than anyone could quite imagine, are, as we drift back through time on this soft and sleepy evening, mostly still children. Somewhere in the colony of Virginia, a small boy named George is learning to ride. In Boston, a young man named John is reading his law books by candlelight. In Philadelphia, an older man named Benjamin is already busy with 100 quiet and curious ideas. And in the rolling hills of Virginia, a boy named Thomas is growing. Up among books and music and the long golden silences of a summer afternoon, we will visit each of them gently, one by one. There is no rush. The evening is long, the fire is warm, and the story, like all the best stories, begins slowly with the sound of wind in the trees, and the smell of wood smoke, and the soft, unhurried passage of time. George Washington was born on the 22nd of February in the year 1732 in a modest house in Westmoreland County, Virginia. The house sat near the Potomac River, and if you stood outside on a still morning, you could hear the water moving gently somewhere through the trees. The river was wide and slow and brown, and it made a sound like the turning of pages in a very large, very old book. His childhood was not grand by the standards of some. The Washingtons were comfortable. They owned land and horses and a small number of enslaved workers. As was common and tragically accepted in Virginia at that time, but they were not among the wealthiest families in the colony. George grew up in a world of practical things, of muddy fields and tobacco plants that had to be tended with patience, of fences to mend and horses to care for, and the slow, steady rhythm of a farming life. He was a tall boy and became a tall man, broad in the shoulder, with hands that were large and capable. He was not, by most accounts, a talkative person. Even as a child, he seems to have carried a kind of quiet steadiness about him, a stillness that made people feel at ease. He listened more than he spoke. He watched before he acted, and when he did act, he moved with a calm deliberateness that was almost unusual in someone so young. A horse moves slowly across a wide field. The morning mist has not yet lifted from the low places. Tilda. When George was 11 years old, his father died. This was a loss that shaped him deeply and quietly, the way a river shapes stone, not all at once, but gradually over years. He came to rely on himself, on his own observations of the world, on the steady example of his older half-brother, Lawrence, who lived at a beautiful estate called Mount Vernon on the banks of the Potomac, and who introduced George to the wider world of Virginia society. George loved the land. This is perhaps the simplest and most important thing to understand about him. He loved the way the light fell across the fields in the early morning. He loved the smell of soil freshly turned. He loved the patient, methodical work of surveying, measuring land, marking boundaries, walking quietly through forest and field with his instruments, making sense of the physical world, one careful measurement at a time. By the time he was 16 years old, George was working as a surveyor, traveling into the western wilderness of Virginia and beyond into the rugged and sparsely settled territory of the Shenandoah Valley. He slept outside under the stars. He crossed rivers on horseback. He ate rough food by firelight and listened to the sounds of the forest at night, the owls and the distant wolves and the wind moving through the tops of enormous trees. These years in the wilderness gave him something that no classroom could have provided: a sense of the land's immense scale, a feeling for its wildness and its beauty, a deep, abiding patience with difficulty and discomfort. He was learning, quietly and without quite knowing it, to endure, to persist, to remain calm when things around him were not calm at all. He came home from his surveys to Mount Vernon, which he eventually inherited after Lawrence's death. and which became the place he loved more than any other in the world. He would spend decades shaping and reshaping that estate, experimenting with crops, improving the soil, planting fruit trees along the curving paths that led down to the river. When he had the choice, when the world was not pressing him into action, this was where he wanted to be. Walking quietly in the early morning, listening to the birds beginning their day, watching the Potomac catch the first light of sunrise, he had a quality that is difficult to name but easy to recognize, a kind of weight to him, a gravity in the older sense of that word, not heaviness or seriousness, but the natural pull that certain people exert simply by being present. People tended to look to him, to wait for what he would say or do. Not because he demanded it, but because there was something in his stillness, in his careful attention that made others feel steadied. He did not yet know what was coming. None of them did. The life he was living, the surveying, the farming, the quiet walks along the river was the life he had hoped for. And in this early chapter of his story, it is enough simply to see him as he was, a young man in love with the land, building something quiet and lasting, one careful day at a time. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston, Massachusetts, in January of 1706, the 15th child of a candle and soap maker named Josiah. The house was small and always full of children, full of the smell of tallow and beeswax, full of the ordinary, cheerful noise of a large and busy family. From a very early age, Benjamin seems to have been a person for whom the world was endlessly, delightfully interesting. He had very little formal schooling. He attended school for only 2 years before his father, recognizing that he could not afford to educate so many children, brought him home to learn a trade. For a time, Benjamin worked in his father's candle shop, cutting wicks and pouring wax. But he was restless in the way that only the truly curious are restless, not with discontent, but with an almost irresistible pull toward the next question, the next experiment, the next page of the next book. When he was 12, his older brother James took him on as an apprentice in his printing shop, and here something clicked into place. The printing shop was, in that era, one of the most intellectually alive places in any colonial town. Books and pamphlets and newspapers passed through it constantly. Ideas arrived on paper from London and Amsterdam and Philadelphia. Benjamin, setting type and pulling the press lever, read everything. He absorbed everything. He taught himself, quietly and systematically, more than most formally educated men of his time would ever know. He read works of natural philosophy, of rhetoric, of history. He taught himself to write by copying out essays he admired, then putting them aside and trying to reconstruct them from memory, comparing his version to the original, finding his weaknesses, improving them. He was, in essence, his own teacher, patient with himself, methodical, endlessly curious. When he was 17, he ran away from his brother's shop. There had been arguments between them, the ordinary friction of two strong personalities, in a small space, and made his way to Philadelphia. He arrived with almost nothing. He walked through the streets, carrying 3 large rolls of bread under his arms, having spent nearly all his money on food. He was young and unknown, and the city was strange to him, but he was not afraid. He was, if anything, simply interested. Philadelphia, in those years, was the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the American colonies. It was a Quaker city, built on principles of tolerance and industry, and it had a quality of busy, purposeful calm that suited Franklin perfectly. He found work in a printing shop, began to make himself known, and within a few years had established his own press and his own newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. He was not yet 30 years old. Franklin the printer is a pleasant figure to spend time with in imagination. Picture him in his shop in the mornings, before the day's business began, sitting at his desk with a cup of something warm, reading through the previous day's correspondence, making small notes in the margins of papers with a stub of pencil. He was not a dramatic person. He did not raise his voice or make large gestures. He was comfortable in his own company. He had a dry, affectionate wit that made people feel at ease, a way of seeing the amusing side of things without ever being cruel about it. His famous almanac, Paul Richard's Almanac, which he began publishing in 1732, was full of the small, practical wisdom he had gathered from years of careful observation. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Lost time is never found again. These were not profound philosophical statements. They were the distilled common sense of a man who had paid close attention to the world and found that it rewarded those who paid it the same close attention in return. And then there were the experiments. Franklin's curiosity about the natural world, about electricity in particular, about the behavior of light and heat and sound, was the curiosity of a man who genuinely did not know the answer and genuinely wanted to find out. His famous experiment with a kite and a key during a thunderstorm, establishing that lightning was, in fact, a form of electricity, was the work of a man who was not performing for an audience, but simply, quietly, trying to understand something. The invention that followed, the lightning rod, saved countless buildings and lives. But Franklin did not patent it. He gave it away freely because he believed that useful knowledge should belong to everyone. By the time of the events that would make him famous in the wider world, the diplomatic missions to London and Paris, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the long and patient work of helping to build a nation, Franklin was already old by the standards of his time. He was past 60. He had lived several full lives already, as a printer, as a writer, as a scientist, as a civic leader who had helped found Philadelphia's first library, its first fire brigade, its first learned society. He was a man whose life contained multitudes, and yet who carried it all with a lightness that was genuinely remarkable. In the evenings, in the years before the Revolution demanded everything of everyone, Franklin liked to sit by a fire with a glass of Madeira, wine and a book, or perhaps with a few close friends, talking in the unhurried way that good friends talk, not arguing, not trying to win, but simply thinking out loud together, turning ideas over in the firelight to see how they looked from different angles. He was happy in those moments, and his happiness, like everything about him, was calm and unforced and perfectly genuine. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13th, 1743, at a place called Shadwell in the colony of Virginia, in a farmhouse that sat in the rolling foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The mountains were not far on a clear day. You could see their long, blue-grey ridgeline from the higher points of his father's land, and they seemed to have had some effect on how Jefferson imagined the world. There was always, in his thinking and his writing, a quality of looking toward the horizon, of reaching for something distant but attainable. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a surveyor and a planter, a big, self-made man who mapped the wilderness and built a comfortable life from the land. His mother, Jane Randolph, came from one of the most prominent families in Virginia. Thomas was their eldest surviving son, which meant that the family's considerable property and social position would come to him. But what mattered more to Jefferson, even as a young man, was not the land or the position, it was the books. By the time he went to study at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, the age of 16, Jefferson had already read more widely than most men twice his age. He had taught himself to play the violin, and he practiced for hours each day, not as a performance, but because the music gave him something that he found difficult to explain. A kind of order, a kind of beauty that satisfied the part of him that was always searching for the exact right thing. He was a perfectionist in the quietest possible way. Williamsburg in the 1760s was a small but lively town, the capital of Virginia, where the colonial legislature met, and the governor's palace stood behind its formal gardens. Jefferson moved through this world with a characteristic combination of intense intellectual engagement and personal reserve. He was not a great public speaker. His voice was not suited to oratory, but in small groups, in conversation, in the exchange of written letters that might travel back and forth between two people for months or years. He was extraordinary. He thought in paragraphs. He wrote the way other men breathed constantly, naturally, as if it cost him nothing. After his studies, he returned to the hills of Virginia and began building his life's great project, Monticello. The name means little mountain in Italian, and it sits on a rounded hilltop about 800 feet above the surrounding countryside, commanding views in every direction of extraordinary beauty. Jefferson designed every part of it himself: the graceful dome, the wide terraces, the carefully proportioned rooms. He filled it with his books, which eventually numbered nearly 7,000 volumes, and with the artifacts of a life devoted to curiosity, fossils and maps and scientific instruments and paintings and the bones of prehistoric animals. He was a man of contradictions, and it is important, even in a gentle telling, to acknowledge them. He owned more than 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. He knew, with the clear-eyed intelligence that he brought to everything else, that slavery was a profound moral wrong. He wrote as much in private letters and in occasional public documents, and yet he did not free them. He depended on their labor for the life he lived. This contradiction sat at the center of his existence and was never resolved. It shadows his legacy and asks questions that do not have comfortable answers. But in the realm of ideas, which was, in truth, where Jefferson was most fully alive, he was remarkable. He believed, with a sincerity that seems to have been completely genuine, that all people were created equal. That the proper purpose of a government was not to exercise power over its citizens, but to protect their natural rights to life, to liberty, to the pursuit of whatever made their particular life meaningful. These were not original ideas. Exactly, they had been argued by European philosophers for decades, but Jefferson gave them a voice that was clear and plain and almost musical in its plainness. He made them feel like common sense. In the evenings at Monticello, before the pressures of public life made such evenings rare, Jefferson would sit in his library, surrounded by his books and his papers and his collections, and read. Sometimes he read history, sometimes natural science, sometimes poetry in French or Italian or Latin, for he had taught himself all of these languages and more with the same patience. methodical self-teaching that Franklin had applied to writing and electricity. He would sit by his window and watch the last light fade from the mountains. And in those long, quiet evenings, with the candles lit and the fire settled to a gentle glow, he was perfectly content. Let us step back for a moment from the lives of the men who will shape history and look simply at the world they lived in. The world of the ordinary colonial morning. Because the founding fathers did not live apart from their time, they were shaped by it, colored by it, rooted in it as deeply as the oak trees were rooted in the Virginia clay. You are walking down the main street of a colonial town. Perhaps it is Williamsburg. Perhaps it is Boston or Philadelphia or the smaller but still lively town of Annapolis in Maryland. The street is unpaved and the morning dew has laid the dust somewhat, so the air smells clean and faintly of earth and horses. The buildings on either side are mostly of wood, painted in the soft colors that the era favored, white and cream and the pale, dusty blues and greens that seem to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. The shops are opening. The baker has been up since before dawn, and the warm, yielding smell of fresh bread drifts out into the street as you pass. The blacksmith is already at work. You can hear the steady ring of his hammer on the anvil before you can see him. A sound so regular and rhythmic that it is almost soothing, like a very slow metronome counting off the morning's first hour. A woman in a linen cap hangs, washing on a line between two trees, the white sheets lifting gently in the morning breeze. Life in the colonies was, by and large, a community life. People depended on each other in ways that are difficult to imagine from the distance of the present. If your barn burned down, your neighbors helped you rebuild it. If you fell ill at harvest time, the men from the surrounding farms came to bring in your crops. This was not generosity in any grand sense. It was simply how things worked. Because everyone understood that when their own time of difficulty came, they would need the same help in return. The rhythms of the day were simple and largely fixed. You woke early before sunrise in the summer, sometimes before the first light in the winter, and immediately there was work to be done. Cows to be milked, fires to be laid, breakfast to be prepared over an open hearth, using pots and skillets that hung on iron hooks in the fireplace. Breakfast was substantial. Porridge or cornmeal mush, perhaps some salted pork, bread and butter if you had it, cider or small beer, because the water could not always be trusted. The children were not idle. Even very young children had tasks. Gathering eggs, fetching water, minding younger siblings, carding wool. Older children worked alongside their parents, learning the skills they would need for the rest of their lives. Boys learned farming or a trade. Girls learned to cook and sew and manage a household, which in that era required a very considerable range of knowledge. How to preserve food, how to make candles and soap, how to treat minor illnesses with the herbs that grew in the kitchen garden, how to spin wool into thread and weave thread into cloth. In the evenings, after supper, the family gathered in the main room of the house around the fireplace. This was the heart of the home, not just for warmth, though the cold could be fierce in New England winters, but for light. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. The firelight was the primary source of illumination, and by it, family members read or sewed or carved or simply talked. Many colonial households had very few books, perhaps a Bible, perhaps an almanac, perhaps a few pamphlets, but they were read and reread, until the pages were soft with handling, Sundays were different from other days. The whole community gathered at the church, which was as much a social institution as a religious one. It was where you saw your neighbors, where news was exchanged, where the small transactions of community life were conducted before and after the service. The minister's sermon might last an hour or more. People sat on hard wooden benches and listened, or tried to listen, or dozed quietly when the afternoon heat and the hard morning's work made it difficult to remain entirely alert. There were pleasures, too. Dances, sometimes, in someone's barn on a Saturday evening, with a fiddle and a fife. The twice-yearly market days when people came in from the countryside and the town was briefly crowded and festive. The first fall apple pressing, when the smell of fresh cider filled the air and everyone came to help and to drink and to talk. These were the moments when life felt most vivid, most communal, most like something worth cherishing. This was the world that shaped the founding fathers. This was the soil they grew in. And understanding it, its simplicity, its hardships, its community, its slow pace helps explain why the idea of liberty was so precious to them. There were people accustomed to managing their own lives, to making their own decisions, to governing their own small corners of the world. The idea that someone far away, someone who had never walked their streets or worked their fields, might tell them how to live, that idea, when it came, felt not just inconvenient, but genuinely wrong. Asterisk the trouble, when it began to come, came slowly. It did not arrive all at once, like a storm. It accumulated the way water accumulates in a low place after a long rain, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day you looked and realized that what had been a trickle was now something much more significant. After the long and expensive war that Britain fought against France and its colonial allies, a conflict that stretched across 2 continents and ended in 1763, the British government found itself deeply in debt. The war had been fought partly in the American colonies, partly to protect them, and the British Parliament decided, not unreasonably from their perspective, that the colonists should contribute to the cost of their own defense. And so taxes were levied. The Stamp Act of 1765 required that almost every piece of paper used in the colonies' legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards, be printed on paper, stamped with a royal seal, and purchased from the Crown. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed duties on imported goods, glass, paper, paint, and tea. These were not enormous sums, by any objective measure, but it was not really about the money, it was about representation. About the long-held English principle that a person should not be taxed except by a legislature in which they had chosen to be represented. The colonists had no seats in the British Parliament. They could not vote for its members. And so when that Parliament decided to tax them, they felt the full weight of something that violated what they had long understood to be their rights as English subjects. No taxation without representation. The phrase moved through the colonies like a slow, quiet fire. It appeared in pamphlets and newspapers. It was debated in taverns and drawing rooms and on the steps of courthouses. It was not a cry of anger. Not at first, it was more like a question, spoken in a careful and almost puzzled tone. How can this be right? How does this accord with everything we understand about the proper relationship between a government and the people it governs? John Adams, the Boston lawyer, was one of those who asked this question with particular precision. Adams was not a romantic. He was not given to grand gestures or soaring rhetoric. He was a compact, serious, somewhat prickly man who had a profound and somewhat gloomy respect for the law, for history, and for the difficulty of getting things right. He had read more legal and political philosophy than almost anyone in the Colonies, and what he read told him, clearly and repeatedly, that what the British Parliament was doing was wrong. But even Adams, in those early years, was not thinking of independence. None of them were. Independence was an enormous thing, an almost unthinkable thing to cut the connection with the country most of them still thought of as the mother country. To stand alone in a world full of powerful empires and old, settled nations. It was frightening to contemplate. What was wanted, initially, was simply to be heard, to be treated with the respect that subjects of the English crown had always understood was their due. The British government, for its part, heard the complaints and largely dismissed them. There were politicians in London who were sympathetic men, like Edmund Burke and William Pitt, who argued that the colonial position was legally sound and that pressing the matter would end badly. But they were not in the majority, and their voices, though clear and reasonable, were not heeded. The tension continued to build in its quiet, incremental way. British troops were sent to Boston to maintain order, and their presence, those red-coated soldiers on the streets, quartered in people's homes, by law felt like an intrusion. Oh wait, there were incidents. A confrontation in Boston in 1770 resulted in soldiers firing into a crowd and killing 5 people. It was called the Boston Massacre, though that word suggests something more organized and more deliberate than what the historical record actually shows. But words matter. And the people who told the story of that night understood the power of words very well. Then there was the tea. In December of 1773, a group of men, some dressed in rough costumes to suggest the disguise of Mohawk Indians. Though the disguise fooled no one, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of East India Company tea into the water. It was not a violent act. No one was hurt. It was, in its strange way, almost a theatrical act, a piece of political theatre performed by firelight on the dark water of the harbor. But it changed everything. The British government's response, the coercive acts, which the colonists renamed, the intolerable acts, closed the port of Boston, restricted Massachusetts' self-governance, and once again required the colonists house British soldiers. It was, in its effect, a declaration that British patience had run out, and it pushed the colonies to do something they had never done before, to come together and speak with one voice. Asterisk, in September of 1774, 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies made their way to Philadelphia for what would be called the First Continental Congress. It was the first time that representatives of so many different colonies had sat together in the same room to discuss their common situation. And it was, in its beginnings, a profoundly cautious gathering. They came by horseback and by carriage, over the long, uneven roads that connected the colonial capitals. Some of them had never traveled so far from home before. Some had never met their fellow delegates except by correspondence, the careful, thoughtful letters that they had been exchanging for years, feeling out each other's positions on the questions that now pressed on everyone. Coming together in person was different. It required accommodation. It required listening. Philadelphia was the perfect city for such a meeting. It was the largest city in the colonies, the most cosmopolitan, the most accustomed to the peaceful coexistence of different religions and different nationalities. The Quakers who had founded it had built it on principles of tolerance and reason, and those principles still colored the city's character. Walking its straight, tree-lined streets, you felt something that the rougher, more contentious Boston did not quite offer: a sense of reasoned order, of the possibility that people could disagree and still find their way through. They met in Carpenter's Hall, a two-story brick building near the waterfront that belonged to the Carpenters' Company, a guild of master craftsmen. It was not a grand space, it was practical, businesslike, with large windows that let in the September light and simple wooden chairs arranged around a long central table. There were no paintings on the walls, no decorations to distract, just the men and the light and the urgency of what they had come to discuss. The mood in that room was, by most accounts, not excited. It was careful. These were men who understood that what they were doing was extraordinary and who were not certain where it would lead. They were lawyers and farmers and merchants. They had families and properties and reputations to consider. Many of them were still hoping, genuinely hoping, that some resolution could be found, some way to restore the proper relationship between the colonies and the crown, without taking the enormous and irreversible step of open defiance. Patrick. Henry of Virginia rose to speak, and his voice, that voice which had already made him famous in the Virginia House of Burgesses for its passionate clarity, filled the room with something that was neither anger nor despair, but something more like earnest, slightly anguished urgency. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more, he said. I am not a Virginian, but an American. It was one of the first times anyone had used that word in quite that way, as the name of a new kind of person. John Adams was there, representing Massachusetts, and he watched and listened with his characteristic combination of sharp attention and emotional reserve. He found himself moved, sometimes unexpectedly, by the quality of certain arguments, by the evident intelligence and goodwill of men he had previously known only through letters, by the strange and significant feeling of being part of something that had never been done before. But he was also, characteristically, worried. He knew how difficult this was. He knew how many things could go wrong. George Washington was there too, sitting quietly among the Virginia delegation. He said very little, as was his habit in large gatherings, but he watched and he thought, and the steady weight of his presence was something people noticed. When he did speak, briefly and quietly, the room attended. The Congress lasted 7 weeks. By the end of it, they had agreed on a formal declaration of colonial rights, a boycott of British goods, and a commitment to meet again the following spring if the situation had not improved. They were not ready for war. They were not ready for independence. But they had done something that could not be undone. They had sat together as Americans and had spoken together about what they believed and what they were prepared to insist upon. And that, in itself, was the beginning of something. They went home through the autumn leaves, along the long roads that led back to their various lives, carrying with them the memory of those 7 weeks, the quality of the arguments, the faces of the men they had met, the particular September light coming through the windows of Carpenter's Hall. None of them could have said quite what would come next, but they had taken a step, and some of them, lying awake in inns along the road home, listening to the wind, probably understood that there would be no stepping back. Asterisk, it was the summer of 1776, and the world was changing faster than it seemed possible to track. The Second Continental Congress had been meeting in Philadelphia since May of the previous year, and in the 14 months since then, everything had shifted. There had been fighting at Lexington and Concord, at Bunker Hill, at a dozen smaller and less remembered places. There had been a winter of desperate recruitment and uncertain supply, and there had been a slow, reluctant, increasingly inevitable movement toward the idea that had once seemed unthinkable, that the colonies must separate from Britain entirely and stand alone. Thomas Jefferson was 33 years old when the Congress asked him to write the Declaration of Independence. He was the youngest member of the drafting committee, but he was chosen because of what everyone who had read his work already knew, that he could write with a clarity and a grace that made even the most complex ideas feel simple and self-evident. He was given a small room on the second floor of a brick house on the corner of Market and 7th Streets in Philadelphia. He had a portable writing desk of his own design, which he placed on the table by the window. The room was modest. A chair, a table, the writing desk. The windows were kept partly closed against the summer heat and the clouds of horseflies that plagued Philadelphia in July, which meant the room was warm and somewhat airless. Outside, the city went about its business, the sounds of horses and carts, the voices of vendors, the occasional distant sound of drums from a company of soldiers drilling somewhere. But inside the room, it was quiet. Jefferson worked in quiet. He did not begin from nothing. He had been thinking about these ideas for years. They were ideas that had been circulating through the political and philosophical literature of the time, in the writings of John Locke, of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of the Scottish philosophers, who had argued for the natural rights of human beings and the proper limits of governmental power. Jefferson had read all of them. He had absorbed them and turned them over in his careful mind until they had become his own. What he was looking for, sitting at that desk in the warm Philadelphia summer, was not novelty. He was not trying to say something that had never been said before. He was trying to say something that everyone felt was true, but that no one had quite said this clearly, this simply, this beautifully. We hold these truths to be self-evident, he wrote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words, written in his careful hand in the quiet room, would become among the most famous in the English language. They were not written in a moment of passion or excitement. They were written carefully, with crossings out and revisions, with long pauses during which Jefferson sat and looked out the window at the summer street and turned the sentences over. In his mind, listening for the exact right word, the exact right rhythm. They were the product of a quiet kind of work that does not look dramatic from the outside, but is, in its way, among the most demanding things a human mind can do. The Declaration took Jefferson about 2 weeks to draft. He showed it first to John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, who were the other most prominent members of the drafting committee. Adams made a few suggestions. Franklin, who had a gift for the precise and memorable phrase, made a small number of changes that sharpened the language without altering its essential character. Then the draft was presented to the full Congress. What followed was the kind of thing that would have driven Jefferson to distraction. He sat and listened as they assembled. Delegates argued over his words, changing a phrase here, removing a section there. They removed, most painfully for Jefferson, a long passage in which he had condemned the slave trade in harsh terms. It was removed because the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia could not accept it, and because the unity of the Congress was more important in that moment than any single passage. Jefferson sat in his chair and said nothing, but his feelings were written in his face, clearly enough that John Adams noticed them and remembered them decades later. On the 2nd of July, the Congress voted to declare independence. On the 4th, they approved the final text of Jefferson's declaration. The delegates signed their names to it, one by one, in the quiet of the State House in Philadelphia. Some of them signed with firm strokes, some signed more carefully, as if they were aware, as all of them must have been aware, of the magnitude of what their names now meant. By signing, they were committing themselves entirely to a cause that was still far from certain. Outside, when the news spread through the city, there was celebration. Bells rang. People gathered in the streets. But in the hall where the document had been signed, a kind of hush settled. The men who had done this thing sat or stood quietly, looking at what they had made, understanding that whatever happened next, the words on that paper could not be unsaid. George Washington became commander of the Continental Army in June of 1775, when the Second Continental Congress voted to appoint him to the position. He accepted the appointment with characteristic humility, he said, in the speech he gave to the Congress, that he did not believe himself equal to the task. This was not false modesty. He genuinely was uncertain. He had fought in the French and Indian War, had led small companies of soldiers through difficult terrain, had known what it was to manage the chaos of a military campaign. But what was being asked of him now was something far larger. He was being asked to take a loose collection of militias, farmers and tradesmen and young men with almost no training, armed with hunting rifles and an uncertain supply of powder and shot, and transform them into an army capable of fighting the most professional and experienced military force in the world. The British Army was disciplined and well equipped. Its officers were trained professionals. Its soldiers had fought in campaigns across Europe and India and the Caribbean. What Washington had, at the beginning, was heart and stubbornness and very little else. And yet there was something in Washington's character that made people believe the impossible was possible. It was not his speeches. He was not a compelling public speaker, and he knew it. It was not his tactical genius, though he learned as he went and proved himself, in the end, a very capable commander. It was something else. Something that is difficult to put in words, but that every person who served with him seemed to feel. He was always there. That is, perhaps, the simplest way to say it. When the soldiers were cold and hungry and exhausted, Washington was cold and hungry with them. He did not sleep in a grand tent apart from the general misery. He was present in the camps, moving among the men, visible, accessible, bearing the same weather and the same difficulty. This is a small thing in the telling, but it was not a small thing in the living of it. Men who are suffering need to know that someone sees it. Washington saw it. He did not minimize it or pretend it was not there. He simply endured alongside them, and his endurance gave them something to imitate. He was also capable of a kind of strategic patience that was, in the circumstances, almost superhuman. He understood, early on, that he could not defeat the British Army in a series of direct, open-field confrontations. They were too well trained, too well supplied for that. What he could do was survive. He could keep his army in existence. He could avoid the decisive defeat that would end the war at a stroke. And he could wait for the British to make mistakes, or for the calculations of European politics to shift in America's favor. There were moments when this patience was tested almost beyond endurance. The winter of 1776 was one of those moments. The army was in retreat across New Jersey, shrinking with every mile as enlistments expired and men simply went home. The mood was close to despair. And then, on the night of December 25th, Christmas night, when the Hessian soldiers on the other side of the Delaware River were celebrating and not expecting anything, Washington led his army across the ice-choked river and attacked. It was a calculated gamble, taken not from desperation, but from careful judgment. The victory at Trenton was small in military terms, fewer than 1,000 prisoners taken, the enemy camps scattered and confused, but its psychological effect was enormous. The army had won. It had crossed an impossible river in winter darkness, and it had won. The enlistments that had been expiring were renewed. New recruits arrived. Something that had been flickering steadied. Washington's personal manner was formal in the way of his time and his class. He did not embrace his officers, or use their first names, or invite the easy familiarity that some leaders cultivate. But within that formality, there was a genuine care, a quality of attention and regard that the men who served him recognized. He remembered names. He noticed when a man had done something well. He was slow to anger and quick to acknowledge the difficulty of what was being asked. In the long and wearing years of the war, this steadiness was as important as any battle plan. He wrote letters constantly to the Congress, to his generals, to suppliers and politicians and foreign diplomats. The letters were models of controlled urgency. They laid out what was needed plainly, without hysteria, without self-pity. They made clear the seriousness of the situation without suggesting that all was lost. They were the letters of a man who was doing an almost impossible thing and who understood that the most important quality he could model, in letter as in person, was calm. Always calm. Asterisk, if you wanted to find the still, silent center of the American Revolution, not the triumphant center, but the enduring center, the place where something that matters most was tested most completely, you might find it in the winter encampment at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. In the months between December of 1777 and June of 1778, the Continental Army arrived at Valley Forge exhausted. They had fought two major engagements in the fall at Brandywine Creek and at Germantown, and they had lost both. The British had taken Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies, and were wintering there in relative comfort, while Washington's army camped in the fields 20 miles to the northwest. The army had been marching and fighting for months. The men were worn through. Valley Forge was not a village or a town. It was a plateau of gently rolling farmland and low hills bounded on two sides by creeks, chosen for its defensible position and its proximity to the road that led back to Philadelphia. When the army arrived, there was nothing there. No buildings, no shelters, no stores of food. Everything had to be built from the frozen ground up. Washington ordered that huts be built, simple log structures, just large enough for 12 men, with fireplaces of wood and clay at one end. The men built them with what they had, which was cold hands and numb feet, and the kind of determination that comes from having no other choice. By the end of December, nearly 1,000 huts stood in rough rows on the plateau, their chimneys sending thin columns of grey smoke into the winter sky. They were dark inside, and they leaked when the snow melted, and they were cold even with the fires burning. But they were shelter. The cold was severe that winter, even by the standards of a Pennsylvania winter. The men had not been adequately supplied. Many had no shoes. They wrapped their feet in rags and moved carefully over the frozen ground, leaving marks in the snow that those who saw them could not easily forget. Food was scarce and irregular. There were days when the soldiers ate nothing, or nearly nothing. The horses died in numbers from cold and hunger, and the sight of them lying frozen in the snow was one of the images that stayed with those who survived the winter for the rest of their lives. Disease moved through the camp. Typhus and dysentery and pneumonia. The camp hospital, such as it was overwhelmed. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge, not in battle, but from the cold and the sickness and the slow, relentless wearing down of bodies that were not adequately fed or sheltered. Their graves were dug in the frozen ground and marked with wooden stakes that the spring winds eventually took. And yet, Valley Forge was not only a story of suffering, it was also the place where something remarkable happened. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich von Steuben arrived at the camp in February, sent by Benjamin Franklin, who had been working in Paris to secure European support for the American cause. Von Steuben did not speak English. He dictated his orders in French and had them translated, but he had a gift for training that transcended language. He began in the simplest possible way. He worked with a model company of 100 men, teaching them how to march in formation, how to load and fire their weapons in sequence, how to maneuver on a field of battle. He worked with them directly, himself, out in the cold, demonstrating what he wanted with patient repetition. And his methods and his obvious commitment to the men he was training spread through the camp. By spring, the army that marched out of Valley Forge was different from the army that had marched in. It moved differently. It held its formations. It had a quality of disciplined competence that it had not possessed in December. The suffering had done something. Two had created between the men who shared it a bond that is difficult to describe but easy to recognize. They had been through something together. They were not merely neighbors and acquaintances fighting side by side. They were people who had kept each other alive in the dark and who carried that knowledge forward into the spring. Washington had been there through all of it. He had ridden through the camp daily, visible and present. He had written his desperate letters to the Congress. He had managed the delicate political situation among his generals, who did not always agree and who sometimes lobbied Congress against each other. He had done all of this in the cold and the uncertainty, with no guarantee that the spring would bring anything better, and with the knowledge that his army was the only thing standing between the American cause and its complete collapse. Asterisk, the end of the war came, as most endings do, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, through a series of events whose significance only became fully clear in retrospect. The decisive engagement was at Yorktown, Virginia, in the autumn of 1781, when Washington and his French allies for France had entered the war in 1778, tipping the balance of power, surrounded a British army commanded by Lord Cornwallis and forced its surrender. The British had been weakened by years of expensive war, by the demands of defending their empire in other parts of the world, by the political difficulty of maintaining public support for a conflict that many at home questioned. When Cornwallis surrendered on October 19th, 1781, when his soldiers marched out of their earthworks and laid down their arms, while a military band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," it was not quite the end, but everyone present understood that it was very close to it. The formal peace treaty was signed in Paris in September of 1783. The representatives of Great Britain acknowledged the independence of the 13 states and their sovereignty over the territory east of the Mississippi River. It was a generous settlement, more generous than many in London thought wise, and it was the product of careful and skillful diplomacy by the American commissioners, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, who had navigated the complex and shifting politics of Europe with considerable skill. When the news reached the American cities, when the newspapers printed it, and the church bells rang, and the people gathered in the streets to celebrate, there was a quality to the celebration that was different from the simple pleasure of victory. There was something deeper in it, a kind of disbelieving wonder. They had done it. These colonies, these farmers and tradesmen and lawyers and printers, had fought the most powerful empire in the world and had not been crushed. They had made something new. George Washington said goodbye to his officers in December of 1783 at Fraunces Tavern in New York City. He had served for 8 years without a salary, had endured the loss of battles and the near collapse of his army, had held together a cause that had sometimes seemed held together by almost nothing. And now it was done. He embraced each of his officers in turn. Some of them wept. Washington's own eyes were wet. He was not a man who showed emotion easily, and so what emotion he showed meant more. Then he rode to Annapolis, where the Congress was meeting, and resigned his commission. This was a thing that kings and generals did not do: give back their power when it was no longer needed. Kings held their power and built monuments to it. Generals became presidents and dictators. Washington understood that what he was doing in that quiet ceremony in Annapolis was as important as anything he had done on a battlefield. He was showing that the power he had held had always belonged to the people, and that when it was no longer needed, it went back to them. He went home to Mount Vernon. He walked his fields. He stood on his terrace and looked out at the Potomac, moving quietly in its brown and silver way through the winter landscape. He was 51 years old, and he felt every year of it the campaigns had aged him, the worry and the cold and the years of inadequate sleep. But he was home. And for a while, for a few years, he was simply a farmer again, tending his land and watching the seasons turn and thinking about what the country had become and what it still needed to become. The peace had been won, but the nation was not yet finished. In fact, in the years immediately following the Treaty of Paris, the young United States was in a somewhat precarious state. The Articles of Confederation, the document under which the 13 states had been loosely governing themselves during the war, were proving inadequate to the needs of a real country. The Congress had no power to tax. It could not regulate trade. It had no means to enforce its decisions. Each state acted more or less as an independent republic, printing its own money, making its own trade deals, sometimes working at cross purposed with its neighbors. It was clear to most thoughtful people that something needed to change. In May of 1787, delegates from all the states except Rhode Island gathered once more in Philadelphia, in the same state. House where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years before to revise the Articles of Confederation. They arrived intending to revise. They ended up creating something entirely new. They met through the long, hot summer, with the windows shuttered against the noise and the heat and the curious passers-by, who would otherwise have been able to hear what was being said. The deliberations were kept strictly secret, a decision that was controversial then and has been argued about ever since, but which probably allowed the delegates to speak more freely and to change their minds without embarrassment. What happens in a room matters. What happens in a room with no observers can be different, can be more honest than what happens in public. The debates were long and sometimes difficult. The large states and the small states disagreed fundamentally about how representation should work. Should states have equal votes, or should representation be proportional to population? The northern states and the southern states disagreed about slavery, about whether enslaved people should be counted for purposes of representation, about whether the slave trade should be permitted to continue. These were not small disagreements. They were disagreements about fundamental things, about justice and power and the nature of the country they were trying to build. James Madison of Virginia was, in many ways, the intellectual architect of what emerged. Madison was a small, quiet, scholarly man, one of the least physically imposing figures at the convention, who had spent years studying the history of republics and federal systems, reading everything that had ever been written about how democracies succeeded and how they failed. He arrived in Philadelphia with a clear plan and the patience to pursue it through months of debate and compromise. Benjamin Franklin was there too, at 81 years old, the oldest delegate by a considerable margin. He was brought to the sessions in a sedan chair because his legs could no longer reliably carry him. He did not speak often, but when he did, the room listened, not just because of his fame and his age, but because he had a gift for finding the angle from which a difficult problem looked more manageable. He was, as he had always been, a reconciler, a person who looked for what people had in common, rather than where they differed. The compromise that finally emerged, the Great Compromise, as it came to be called, gave the large states what they wanted in the House of Representatives, where seats were apportioned by population, and gave the small states what they wanted in the Senate, where each state had 2 votes, regardless of size. It was not a perfect solution. It was a practical one. And in the imperfect, practical world of real politics, practical solutions are often the best that can be achieved. The convention concluded in September of 1787, and the completed constitution was sent to the states for ratification. There followed a long and serious public debate in newspapers, in town halls, in the pamphlets that became known as the Federalist Papers, written by Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, about whether this new framework of government was sound, whether it properly protected the rights of individuals, whether it granted too much power to the central government or too little. The debate was genuine and consequential. People cared about these questions with a depth and seriousness that is worth pausing to appreciate. They understood that what they were deciding would shape their children's lives and their children's children's lives, and they did not take that responsibility lightly. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, and a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, protecting freedom of speech and religion and assembly and the rights of the accused, among other things, was added in 1790-1. Washington was elected the first president of the United States in 1788, unanimously, the only man in American history ever to receive the electoral votes of every elector. He accepted, reluctantly, and served 2 terms with the same steady, careful, largely impartial quality he had brought to everything else. He set the precedents. He established the tone. And when his 2 terms were done, he stepped down, demonstrating once more that the power of the office had never belonged to him. They grew old, eventually, as all people do. The urgency that had defined their middle years gave way to the quieter rhythms of age. Letter writing, and sitting in the sun, and thinking back over lives that had been, by any measure, extraordinary. They were different people, these men. They disagreed with each other, sometimes profoundly, about politics and economics and the direction the young country should take. They were not a unified group in their private lives. They were rivals and friends and occasional enemies, shaped by the particular circumstance of having been needed at exactly the right moment. Benjamin Franklin died on April 17th, 1790, at the age of 84, in his home in Philadelphia, surrounded by his daughter and her family. He had been reading until very close to the end. His last weeks were peaceful. He drifted in and out of sleep, and his friends reported that even in his final illness, he was calm, and occasionally quite witty. 20,000 people attended his funeral. It was the largest gathering Philadelphia had ever seen. George Washington died on December 14th, 1799, at Mount Vernon, from a throat infection that the medical treatments of the day made worse, rather than better. He had spent the day before riding around his farm in sleet and rain, as he always did, checking on his crops and his fences. He was 67 years old. He died, by the accounts of those present, with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his life, patient with the pain, thoughtful toward the people around him, composed, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who had been friends, then rivals, then estranged, then friends again in their old age, corresponding in letters of extraordinary depth and warmth, died. On the same day, July 4th, 1826, it was, by the strangest coincidence of history, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Adams's last words, according to those at his bedside, were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He did not know that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. As the summer morning was turning to noon, James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, for his central role in its design, lived the longest of the principal founders, dying in June of 1836 at the age of 85. He spent his last decades at his Virginia estate, Montpelier, tending his garden, corresponding with an endless stream of admirers and questioners, and carefully managing the papers and notes from the Constitutional Convention, a legacy he was deeply concerned to preserve accurately for posterity. Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and controversial Secretary of the Treasury who had done more than almost anyone else to shape the nation's financial system, died much younger, at 49, in the summer of 1804, from a wound suffered in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr. His death was mourned with genuine grief and genuine outrage. He was a complicated figure, brilliant and often arrogant, visionary and sometimes reckless. But his contribution to what the country became, economically, institutionally, was profound. What they left behind, all of them together, was something fragile and extraordinary. A framework of government based not on the authority of a king or the power of an aristocracy, but on the consent of the governed. A set of ideals: liberty, equality, the rule of law, the right to speak and to believe and to disagree without fear, that were not fully realized in their own time, and that the country is still in many ways working toward. They were not perfect men. They knew it themselves. They were men of their time, shaped by its limitations as well as its possibilities. They owned enslaved people, some of them. They excluded women from public life. They committed acts of injustice toward the indigenous peoples of the continent. The gap between their ideals and their practice is one of the central tensions of American history, and it is a tension that has never fully been resolved. The work of making the ideals real, of extending them to everyone, not just to the comfortable and the powerful, is work that each generation inherits and must continue. But something genuine was accomplished. In those years between 1776 and 1789, something that had not been quite done before, in quite this way. A collection of people argued their way peacefully, or mostly peacefully, through words and debate and the patient work of persuasion, toward a set of principles about how human beings ought to live together. And then they tried, imperfectly, and with many failures, to build those principles into the structure of a government. The Declaration of Independence still exists. You can see it if you travel to Washington, the capital city that bears Washington's name, and stand in the dim, climate-controlled room where it is preserved. The paper has faded and the ink has faded, and not all of it can be read clearly anymore, but the words are still there. The careful, patient, beautiful words that Jefferson wrote in that warm Philadelphia room in the summer of 1776, by the light of a candle at a portable desk, while outside the city went about its ordinary summer business. They wanted something that all people have wanted, in every time and every place: to live without fear, to speak their minds, to make their own choices, to raise their children in safety and in hope. They were not alone in wanting this. Every generation wants it. But they were given the particular circumstance of being present at a moment when it was possible to build it, or try to build it. And they brought to that moment everything they had: their intelligence, their courage, their patience, their capacity for work and sacrifice and compromise. Think of Franklin at his desk in the morning, reading with his cup of something warm and his dry, gentle humor. Think of Jefferson at Monticello, watching the last light fade from the mountains, his violins somewhere nearby. Think of Adams reading his law books by candlelight in Boston, worried and earnest and entirely himself. Think of Washington walking his fields in the early morning mist, listening to the Potomac, carrying whatever it was he always carried, that steady, patient, enormous sense of what needed to be done. They are all gone now, long gone, their voices stilled, their handwriting fading in the archives. But what they built endures, as the best human work endures. Not perfectly, not without cracks and strains, but with a basic structural soundness that has allowed it to survive for more than 2 centuries. And on quiet evenings, when the world outside is still and the fire is burning low, it is possible to feel, just faintly, the presence of that work, its age and its weight and its strange, durable beauty. Let the story settle around you now, like the wood smoke settling in a quiet room. Let the images drift and soften. The fields of Virginia in the early morning, the printing press in Philadelphia, the candle flame in the room where a young man was writing something that would outlast him by centuries, the river moving in the darkness, the stars above Valley Forge, the long, patient corridors of history leading somewhere that no one could quite see that everyone was trying to build. You don't need to hold any of it tightly. Let it rest. Let it be what it was, a story of people trying their best in a difficult and uncertain time to make something worth making. That is enough. That is, in the end, the only story there is.